So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful and warm, windy winter day. This is the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum's 2023 online lecture series. My name is Shauna, and I'm the Assistant Curator and Education Programmer at the museum. And joining us today is Dr. Ron Williamson, the founder and now Senior Associate of Archaeological Services, Inc., for his talk, The Discovery and Investigation of the John Butler Homestead, Perspectives from 2 Decades Later. 20 years ago, ASI's investigations yielded over 50,000 ceramic sherds, over 14,000 animal bones, and almost 100 artifacts related to flintlock firearms and military uniform accoutrements where John Butler's homestead was located. These finds allowed archaeologists to reconstruct the family's meal systems, interpret life in the Butler home, and identify the archaeological evidence of the War of 1812 skirmishes at the site. Dr. Williamson will summarize these findings in his presentation today. Ron has quite the resume. He holds an honors BA from the University of Western Ontario and an MA and PhD from McGill University, all of which are in anthropology. He has published extensively on both Indigenous and early colonial Great Lakes history. He's directed the archaeological management plan for the town of Niagara-on-the-Lake and directed excavations at the Snake Hill and Peace Bridge sites in Fort Erie. Of course, the Colonel John Butler Homestead in Niagara-on-the-Lake and the Kings Point Archaeological Site as well. He has received several accolades, including recently in 2019 when he was awarded the Heritage Toronto's Lifetime Achievement Award. We are very excited to have you join us today and to hear more about the work you and your team did at the Butler site. But before I hand the reins over to you, Ron, I just wanted to let everyone joining us today know that we will have a question and answer period at the end of this talk. You can submit your questions in the chat box or by clicking the Q&A icon on your screen. We will do our best to get to all of the questions today. And today's presentation is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube channel in the coming days. So I'm going to take everything. You can take the reins over now, Ron. I'm here in the background if there's any technical issues. Hopefully the wind doesn't knock any of our power or internet out today.
Yeah, it's blowing here in Toronto. Thank you very much, Shauna. I see a lot of people I know in the participants. I'm going to see if I can share screen here and get us started. Welcome to you all. Thank you for attending. Hang on 1 second while I get this going. Here we go. It's fascinating to go back to something that you did 20 years ago and think about it and especially reflect on what you learned about the site given the 2-decade interval since you did that. It's customary to begin with a land acknowledgement, but this is a slightly different land acknowledgement that was written by Rick Hill, a Haudenosaunee elder and scholar, and one that I really like because it's not about ownership of the land or who was there traditionally, but about our obligations to the land, as you can see here. But I also include beside this land acknowledgement an image of an 8,000-year-old spear point that we found on the Butler site, along with over 400 other artifacts that speak to the fact that the site was a campsite that had been used intermittently on multiple times for 6,000 years. It's not something that we were talking about at the time that we were doing this work, but when one reflects about the close ties that John Butler and his sons had with Indigenous people, it's exceptionally interesting that the homestead site that was chosen had this kind of Indigenous content on it. And while we're speaking of Indigenous content and the War of 1812 in particular, I just wanted, I'm sure all of you have seen this, but I wanted to point to this wonderful commemorative memorial at Queenston that Tim Johnson and his team put together. I love this commemoration as it speaks to the very real input of Indigenous folks in the War of 1812. And really, when one thinks about the context that we have to consider for John Butler, it begins with the Revolutionary War. He was born in the kind of early 18th century, but the Revolutionary War provides the context for our understanding of John Butler's Rangers. What you're looking at is an image of Johnson Hall in New York, where William Johnson and his excuse me, and his son, Guy Johnson, who were deputy superintendent, held many meetings with Indigenous peoples. And John was employed as an Indigenous interpreter because he could speak the languages, which was fascinating and so important for allowing the British to interact with their Indigenous allies. Of course, he's best known for Butler's Rangers, which was as a result of a number of wealthy people in New York who were not drawn into signing the Articles of Association by the Continental Congress. And he was asked to organize raids. And in 1777, he raised a corps of Rangers who many of whom had worked with Indigenous people and could fight alongside the Haudenosaunee against the Americans. And that's how we ended up having the log barracks in Niagara-on-the-Lake on the west side of the Niagara River. We also know that he was an absolutely essential character in establishing Newark as the capital of Upper Canada, which was created in 1791. If you just kind of peruse this slide for a bit, you can see the number of positions that he held. And the conclusion that the family was within this social circle of prominent citizens. And it had 70 dwellings in 1796, the year of his death. So it grew in the late 18th century dramatically, and he left quite a legacy behind. Now, while the Rangers disbanded in 1784, he was probably living in the barracks until that time, understanding how the land around 2 Mile Creek was distributed among the Butler family is kind of interesting. His wife and their younger children had been held hostage in New York during most of the Revolutionary War. And it's interesting that she died in 1793, and he left a will that divided all of the various properties that he held among his sons. And the most important thing to take of this, if you look at this carefully, is that all of the Butler sons and people known to him had properties here. The Butler Homestead extended through the latter property, Andrew Butler's property, extended through the Andrews Glen property, which was the subdivision that occasioned the excavation of the site. But it was his son Johnson who did not inherit land that had structures. That leads to the conclusion that while Andrew had inherited parcels of land with buildings on another lot, Johnson had not. And it's likely that Johnson Butler occupied his parents' house, which is on that famous Gray's map of 1810. So this is a famous painting of the Butler Homestead by Shelley Hewson, prominent an OTL citizen. How did archaeology lead to this painting? And that's really part of what I want to talk about today, is to remind you all of the findings that ASI made at the site. We were not the first on the site. There was another consultant that the property managers at the time had retained, who found the site through test pitting in this kind of forested area. And we were retained to come in and try to determine from the remains that have been found in a series of test pits by this other consultant, Mayor Heritage Consultants, if we could figure out just how much of the Butler Homestead might have survived archaeologically. We know that the homestead had been burned in 1813 by Americans retreating from their occupation of the homestead and other locations. So we knew that we had to do a pretty fulsome excavation to answer the questions of what remained of the homestead. This work was done under license and is regulated by the Ontario Ministry of Culture. And we also understood that the entire site had been plowed, so they used some machinery to remove the plow zone, having screened those areas that had very significant remains in the plow zone, artifactual remains in the plow zone. We could get to things like foundations. So these are the 1 meter units that were actually screened, and these are the yields that we found in each of those units. So the green you're seeing has artifact counts of 300 to 500 artifacts. The red is artifact counts of over 1,000. There are a couple of things that I want to show you. One is that these are the areas of the school trenches, and I'm going to talk about the schools in a second, but this is another area that had very high counts, which was the location of an early root cellar, probably the first structure, indicating the presence and location of the first structure on the property. Here are the foundations that we found, and you can see that there were some very high counts as well, just to the west of the structure. So we decided to make as much as we could of the excavation from the perspective of educating the public about Butler history and about the importance of doing archaeology on important colonial sites like this. So we operated school programs in June where we excavated those 2 trenches, and students were assigned buckets and trowels, and they would trowel off the soil in the unit, as you see here, and they would then take that over to the screens that are in the background and screen through, and our staff would help identify what it was they were finding. The schools that were involved are listed there in the second paragraph. I do want to draw attention to Dexter, the site cat, who visited every student usually and every crew member every day, spent most of his time on the site. I'm not sure we knew exactly who owned Dexter, but we sure were glad of his presence. We also had dates in June and July for the public to participate. So we would have people come in and split them into small groups and do pretty much the same kind of thing that the students were doing, which was to trowel units and take the spoil from their troweling and screen it. And this was a way of really bringing this exercise to the public's attention. So we found that the actual walls of the Butler structure was, when we say organic, it means that it wasn't set in one particular style, and that obviously the house kind of evolved in form and structure over time. but that the first part of it was kind of a slate shale foundation, and then later on in the main part of the cabin you had a fieldstone foundation. We noted that this was kind of in keeping with general military form in other rangers' houses, so it wasn't surprising. That's Andrew Klisch in the bottom slide. Some of you may know Andrew from many archaeological sites that he's worked on in the Niagara area. We found considerable evidence of burning. I mentioned earlier that we know that the Americans burned the structure to the ground when they left. And you can see here, especially in the bottom left, that the house had been burned and that all wood had totally disintegrated and burned, but that brick also, probably from the fireplace, was burned. And we found a fair amount of rubble. And these are very early bricks, late 18th century bricks. So we know that they derived from the cabin, and all of these clues from the archaeological record just confirmed, of course, the age, the early age of the cabin. There were several features that were pretty interesting when we found them. So, for example, these little kind of wall sections here, which is feature 14 right here on this side, and leading into, and we thought maybe that was going to lead to a full root cellar, but it did not. And so it probably led to some kind of crawl space, as we indicated. But one of the more interesting features was this one, which is right here, feature 11, which was, I think, some form of larder. There was, it apparently had been lined with tin, lots of hand wrought nails with tin adhering to it. And we found several wine bottle fragments and a metal barrel hoop. There wasn't much in the larder that was left behind. That's probably what that was. I mentioned the large area of excavation of 1 meter units, and that had been placed, or we knew the location of this root cellar by that 1 meter excavation that had occurred on the site. And you'll recall from that, it was quite a large area. So we did excavate the root cellar, and you can see here we're excavating down into it. So this was incorporated into the first structure. There wasn't a foundation of this first structure, but you can see that it was, 12, 13 feet by about 10 feet, and roughly 140 centimeters deep, which would be, closer to 4 feet deep. It was absolutely filled with 18th century artifacts. So we know this is likely the first structure on the site. I note that most of the 18th century military buttons recovered from the site were found in the units surrounding this root cellar, or the cabin that had been or that had existed above the root cellar. So what were the archaeological artifacts that we found, and how do they tell us about life at the homestead? Shauna said in the introduction, 50,000 ceramic sherds, over 14,000 faunal remains, that's animal bone, which allowed us, to some extent, actually, to reconstruct the meal systems at the Butler Homestead. And as my colleague Eva McDonald said, to put the meat back on the bone and roast back on the plate. So just generally, meal times would have been around 3 to 4 in the afternoon. The provisioning of Newark, Niagara was pretty good. And they had access to the Atlantic world, which is reflected in this and other sites, the material that's found on it. Citrus fruits, for example, were all reaching Newark and Niagara. So I'm about to show you some slides that come from a presentation that was done by ASI's Director of Historical Archaeology, Ian McDonald, and Susanna Needs Howarth, who's a faunal analyst who worked on this collection. They published this paper in Northeast Historical Archaeology in 2013. So the ceramics were very typical of late 18th century. There was a fair amount of creamware with the royal rim pattern, same kind of creamware found at Upper Canada's first Parliament buildings in Toronto and Fort York. In any kind of major institution at this period, or major colonial site at this period, would have this kind of creamware. But we also started to find very early pearlware, and also some kind of early Chinese pottery that is reflective of material at that time, as well as black basalt ware, which was considered an expensive ware, and there was a fair amount of it at the Butler site, and as we say here, consistent with his status in the community. This is a very popular 18th century cookbook. Her name is Hannah Glasse's that's her cookbook, and we have, I love this, the Order of Modern Bill of Fare. We have a series of courses that might be served to your guests, and we'll go through a few of those and relate them to the faunal remains or animal bones that we found on the site. So an elegant first course would be typical. You might have soup. We'll return to that point in a minute, but here we have sirloin of beef, veal, turkey, stewed venison, oyster loaves. So this would be typical of this time period. There was also evidence of butchering of cattle on the Butler farm, including some kind of horned breed, which a fanciful illustration here. Food service was represented by 12 meat dishes, including this lovely green shell-edged piece. We did not find soup plates or tureens on the site, which was very interesting and perhaps points to the fact that soup was not part of that elegant first course on the Butler table. But pretty clearly, Georgian-style meals prevailed. The cooking of meats was probably done over an open fire at this point, unlike what might have occurred in an English colonial house of the period. But meats were typically roasted, sometimes boiled, sometimes stewed. We found fragments of a mustard bottle from Rhodes and Kemmy's, a famous mustard producer in Sparta, New York. And we found lots of passenger pigeon, sturgeon, white-tailed deer. So we're very much looking at a mix of wild and domestic species as we consider the animal remains on the site. 39 different taxa, and you can read here the various fish types. And the fact that deer was brought back to the farm whole, which means that it was found or hunted close to home, and it was butchered right on the site based on the presence of feet and cranial fragments. On indigenous sites where people are hunting deer from some distance, you don't find that pattern. You find that the carcasses are brought back and the extremities left behind. So this was an interesting finding of the site as well. So what would an elegant second course consisting of 9 dishes be? Well, you would have the potted venison here, potato pudding, some salmon, strawberry fritters, which I love. But here's the tug-to-pigeons, that passenger pigeon that we talked about there. And here are references to the actual Hannah cookbook and what we found here. So page 181 of that cookbook tells us how to roast a fillet of sturgeon or to boil sturgeon. Just to go down to one of the other ones, here's wild pigeon. So what you need to do with these, and you know, whether they can be used as a first course or second, stew, jug. So we actually got pretty far down into the weeds here of putting together the recipes that might have been followed on the Butler farm based on the amount of bone that we found on the site and the status of the butlers. Here's a little bit more of that. You can see here lots around beef and lots around mutton. And the cookbooks of the cookbook of the day told one how to dress it, how to ragu it, and it's part of the reconstruction of that meal system we're talking about. Now, every good meal, as we all know, requires good wine. And wine, we found pieces of 15 unique wine glasses from the site. And we know also that Catherine obviously was holding tea parties as well, based on some very elegant teawares that were found on the site, that some of which clearly date to the 1780s, late 1780s and early 1790s. So this Chinese porcelain saucer is absolutely stunning, this one here. We also found parts of a peppermint essence bottle from the site. And Eva and Suzanne could envision John at the end of a big meal, unsettled from all the rich food, reaching for the peppermint essence to settle his stomach. And he might have had a smoke with that peppermint. There were almost 2,000 white ball clay smoking pipe fragments, most of which are plain stems, so just a piece of the white clay stem. But there was one almost complete TD specimen. You'll see the TD here. And it's a style that was common on Revolutionary War period sites like Fort Michilimackinac. So you can see here that it's the first pipe of this nature is attributed to Thomas Dormer of London, 1748 to 1770, and this is probably what this pipe dates to. Some very interesting adornment pieces where you have this absolutely lovely carnelian stone piece with a Greek malin profile. Might have been used to impress the owner's mark into wax when sealing documents of the period. This is a lead seal of some sort that is often found on fur trade sites of the period, but they've been altered. This has this perforation in its center. Maybe it was used as a closing device for a pouch or a buckskin coat. Other pieces of adornment include lots of shell and glass beads. You can see in the upper image. Wampum beads, which wouldn't be surprising to find on somebody who was the superintendent for Indian Affairs, or even his sons who had lots of indigenous friends, and there would have been lots of interaction on the site. And also glass beads of the period. There is a period disc stamped with Alexander Davidson, which is a brass gilt finish. It doesn't have a date on it, but it's very much of that period. And then on the lower right, you have one of the 4 silver objects that was found on the site that were parts of bracelets or brooches. This is probably a clasp fragment from a bracelet, has the British Land hallmark, and it's tentatively identified with a Montreal fur trade silversmith named Narcisse Roy, and dates to 1782. We also found a 1788 George III halfpenny on the site, so that you can see here there's lots of material from the late 18th century and the very early occupation of the site, which makes this a really important colonial collection. There were medicinal ointment pots on the site. That the one on the left kind of matches a pedestal type dating to between 1690 and 1780. One on the right, somewhere same period, 1760 through 1780. Just absolutely exciting for the archaeologists, for the crew to be finding this early material. Now, talking about evidence of the military on the site, obviously we found lots of material that was not surprising. For example, buttons from John Butler's Rangers. And these are, I mean, it's not that they're exceptionally rare, but they're rare and they're rarely found in context. So it was lovely to find these sites on John Butler's, or find these buttons on John Butler's homestead. So left, Butler's Rangers uniform, right, Lincoln Militia, just to give you a sense of what these uniforms looked like at the time. Other not too surprising finds are other military buttons. The 60th Regiment Royal American Silver Officer's button from the site is a little bit unique in that, as you can see towards the end of the paragraph here, it's not clear how the button came to the site. This unit was in Canada in 1786 until 1797, but not there. So not in Newark. So it's interesting. And we have the kind of common military button at the site was the RCVs. 16 buttons were recovered. This is a battalion that was headquartered at Fort George from 1798 to 1802 and had worked on the fort's construction. So it speaks to the military connections of the family. And the battalion, as it's noted here, was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John McDonnell, who was a captain in Butler's Rangers. So following up in talking a little bit about the War of 1812 military history reflected on the site, there was considerable action in the area, in this area, in 1813 when the Americans landed and passed through this general area. Later in that same summer, there were skirmishes between the British and Americans who had established pickets on some of the Butler farms. And the Canadian militia had been directed to take posts in the woods in the neighborhood of the pickets on these farms. So what we did is a detailed analysis of the spatial distribution of 72 artifacts related to period firearms and other military equipment that might give us a little bit of a sense of that. So here's the map. Here's the Butler Homestead farm here with number 3 picket. Number 4 picket here on Thomas Butler's cabin property. So the British and Allies hold the farm here. You can see the red are balls and uniform items, gun parts, musket flints, etc. In the blue are U.S. Army. So we have kind of the initial occupation by obviously the British and their allies. And what we find here are musket parts, a left trigger guard, and a butt plate for a short land pattern musket. We have British Brandon flints from, this is a flint mined in Suffolk and found at the Butler Homestead. But then the U.S. Army holds the farm. And is that reflected? And the answer is yes. So look at all these blue items now. And French flints and armament of the U.S. So here is an American 8th Regiment of Infantry script I, probably relating to the occupation of the site in 1813, although it's somewhat puzzling because the 8th Regiment wasn't known to be in the area, but these are questions that pop up in excavations of this nature. We had similar questions with buttons that popped up at Snake Hill when we excavated that site in the early 90s or late 80s. Here are the French flints. Some of them are rifle size, some of them are musket size. The American system of grouping buckshot with a ball to load a cartridge, which is actually demonstrated with artifacts from this site. And then the British Allies attacked the American picket locations, as I indicated earlier. And you begin to see that. Here's one of the British attacks. It can be traced through impacted lead balls. So these display impact with solid objects. But also, here's a piece of a shako of a Glengarry Light Infantry and a badge with a hunting horn, and right is a chin strap scale. So the back and forth of the British and Americans in 1813 is reflected in the material culture of the site. And I have to say that we were surprised to find all of that. And it's not like we can trace the movement of people, but you can see the presence of the Americans and the presence of the British re-attacking and of course holding in the beginning. So the site in general is an interesting mix of Revolutionary War, of someone who was very important in the Revolutionary War, and a unit, Butler's Rangers, that was exceedingly important in the war, and also kind of the early history of Newark, and then the War of 1812 as well. So we were delighted to find so much of the site, and we were, quite frankly, as archaeologists at the time, and I recall this emotional kind of feeling strongly of being very afraid that it was going to disappear because of the development. But it's clear and the most significant result of our work was that people in the town, Parks Canada, and even the developer at the time, but mainly local resident heroes, reached agreements to protect lots 64 and 65, which allowed the commemoration of Butler, his family, in this early period. The Butler Homestead Monument, as you can see here, was unveiled on Sunday, May 18th, 2008. So 8 years after we had been on the site, it took that long to get the money together to purchase the land and to come up with a plan on how to properly do that. You can go out there today and see this if you have not, and read the plaques on the monument. Finding the homestead, there's a little plaque about that. And then secondly, a little bit about the homestead itself. As you can see, just at the top of the Butler Homestead, lived here with his wife, Catherine, who died in 1793, and Butler, who died in 1796. So if you make your trek out there, you will find that the monument is here, but also the foundations that we found and uncovered are now identified by lines of crushed rock in the grass, which gives you a clear idea of the location. Well, it signifies the location of the original building, which is still there, as I understand it. So this commemoration effort was exceedingly important, but the people responsible for that need to be acknowledged. So Laura Dodson and Shelley Hewson were exceptionally important at that time. I want to give a nod to Jean Jukin, who many of you know, who worked with us on the stone foundation and shared his knowledge of building practices on structures of this period. Joy Ormsby, who I understand recently passed. She had amazing research of her own on the Butler family. And she also worked pretty closely with us and commented on our first draft of the historical summary prepared for the project. Laura Dodson, many of you remember, was instrumental in ensuring the conservation of a portion of the site. She also helped organize the St. Andrews Glen Committee, Archaeology Committee, that dedicated itself to that goal. The committee also had Joy. It had Tom Richardson, a lawyer from St. Catharines, who's very prominent in important matters in the region. Ron Dalglish, Aggie Tarnoil, who worked at St. Andrews Glen, and of course, Ron Dale, Ellen Lloyd, Ron Dale from Parks Canada at the time, and Ron is still present and productive in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Of course, Elizabeth Oliver Malone gave generously of her time to this project, and as recently as, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, I was hearing from Elizabeth, so I know that she was quite active and is still quite active. We worked somewhat closely with Parks Canada during this project. In particular, Ron Dale made a lot of things happen for us. He is the former curator of Fort George, but he was a kind of a reassuring presence on that archaeology committee, and his support for our project was crucial. But I want to point to Shelley Hewson. I don't know if she's in the audience today, but she was our honorary crew member. She wasn't a paid crew member, as I recall at the time, but her contribution went well beyond the work on the site. She went on, of course, to be instrumental in the foundation of the Little Bank School. But her illustrations of artifacts are in the report, and her illustration of the homestead itself was essential and is on the cover of the report. So here are some of the articles that came out of this excavation. You've seen the first one, but with Brian Nari, Eva did a piece called Occupied by the Enemy, which really talks about the skirmishes of the Butler farm and lays out a little bit more detail what I was showing you about the discovery of War of 1812 period material and what it says about the history of the skirmishes that occurred on the property. Denise McGuire wrote a PhD, but also a summary article in International Journal of Historical Archaeology, in which she focused on a taste for mustard, which this is a respected international journal. So the Butler material has been seen by people around the world interested in this period. People often ask me, where is all the Butler material? It's not in Niagara-on-the-Lake. It's not held by Parks Canada. It's held by the Canadian Museum of History, and it's held at their request. Some years ago, in the beginning of the decade, well, I guess it was around 2010, 11, somewhere around there. The curator of Ontario Archaeology at the Canadian Museum requested that because of the importance and significance of this site, that it be, that the assemblage be housed permanently and curated by the Canadian Museum of History. Of course, we agreed to that request immediately. Our final report on this, if you want to get really into the weeds, you can find on ASI's website. That's the link at the bottom. You can see Shelley's illustration on the cover of the report. But in here, you can see catalogs of all of the artifacts and see all of the detail around the excavations that occurred on the site. It's very difficult to summarize such a complex site with tens of thousands of artifacts in 40 minutes, but I've attempted to do that. So I think we can maybe have some Q&A. So I will stop the share.
Thank you so much, Ron. I don't know if anyone else got really hungry about halfway through. So I'm really glad it's almost lunchtime. Oh my gosh, the thought of, venison and mutton and all of that. Oh, so good. We do have a couple of questions. You did answer one on, where that collection is. And I do want to just clarify a little bit why it's not at the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum. And it's because typically after a dig is done, all of the boxes have to go to one institution. They can't be broken up. And our organization just doesn't have the space to store. How many boxes in the end was it? Do you know, Ron?
Dozens.
We don't have the storage capacity at this time to store, dozens and dozens of boxes. But we do have a couple of questions. So when you said, 9 dishes of an elegant first course, do you mean that they served all 9 dishes, or were they dishes that they could choose from?
So what Eva and Suzanne were doing was looking at the faunal remains from the site and imagining, based on a cookbook, what might have been served as part of that. So, for example, soup would be part of that 9-course first, or 9-serving first course. But we didn't find any soup bowls or tureens on the site, so we don't think that happened. So really, it's an imagining of what happened on the Butler Homestead at the Butler table, based on what we found archaeologically, both in the ceramics tableware, but also in the faunal remains, and what was typical on sites of that period based on this cookbook. So the fact that we found lots of passenger pigeon, one of those meals had passenger pigeon recipes. So that would have been on the table at Butler.
I don't know how great that would be. Passenger pigeon.
Well, apparently it was quite tasty. When you read reports of the day, people love that, and that's why they were hunted out of the sky on Tuesday.
Absolutely. Were there any other areas near the Butler site that you would like to have explored but were not able to?
It's an interesting question. We actually ended up at the site for about 6 weeks longer than we had anticipated or indeed budgeted for. So ASI spent about 6 weeks of group time donated to the project, just because we wanted to complete the excavation of the area that we were investigating. The reason for that was the richness. It was so rich, and if in one unit you found 300 artifacts in a square meter, and you maybe thought that you were going to stop at that unit, well, you had to keep going, obviously, because you wanted to recover as many of the artifacts off the site as you possibly could. So we were not at all, at the end of the day, we were not at all disappointed on that particular property that we didn't get all that we wanted to get. I think we did. We certainly found all of the, excuse me, structural foundation remains that we wanted to find. So we were happy with that. As for other properties in Niagara-on-the-Lake, there's lots. And the archaeological management plan, actually the whole purpose of that plan was to identify properties with archaeological potential that should be examined prior to any development. That plan has a very simple yes/no answer for planners in Niagara-on-the-Lake. If the property in question shows archaeological potential, then they should absolutely call for an archaeological assessment in advance of development. So that's the way planning works, and that's the way the archaeological management plan should be used.
Wonderful. Just jumping on that, we know Butler enslaved individuals. Was there any evidence of their home and artifacts pertaining to those that he enslaved on the site, or did it not expand that far out?
We did not find any evidence of separate structures for them. So I can't answer that question, only in that we didn't find evidence of that. And we didn't find, I'd have to go back to the report to be absolutely certain of this, but I don't recall that we found any kind of artifactual material that spoke to the Black presence on the site in the same way that some Civil War sites have.
Wonderful. Were there any medical or surgical artifacts discovered?
Well, outside of the ointment pot, so that's medicinal ointment, there were not like surgeons' tools, etc., or surgeons' instruments. I don't recall that. I'd have to check the report, but nothing pops to mind. I would have included that if there had been something very important.
Someone is wondering what the exact address of the Butler Homestead is.
So
There's not an exact.
I don't know the exact address on one of those slides. It shows you where it is. There's an aerial there that shows you it's in that St. Andrews Glen neighborhood. I can tell you that this past summer, I was doing a tour for the Archaeological Conservancy out of northeastern United States, and we were visiting Fort George for a day, and they wanted to fill an hour, and I said, well, let's go to Butler's Homestead because there's some archaeological content there. And I hadn't been there for a long time, and I took a large bus into that neighborhood and navigated my way just on instinct back to the site, so you can find it very easily. Just go into the neighborhood and look for the forest kind of, and you will find it.
It's past the roundabout, so go through the roundabout there, and then it's just on your left-hand side.
Yes.
One of the questions is there a plan for an exhibit of the Butler artifacts at the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum sometime in the future? There aren't any current plans. I can answer that one. At this time, we are kind of in a limbo area with our expansion and renovation plans. So we don't really quite know when we're moving off site. So we do have one more exhibition coming up that'll open in early June. And we believe it'll be the last one until our expansion and renovation happens. But it's definitely something we can look at putting on the schedule for in the future. There seems to be quite an interest in Butler, and I'm sure a lot of people would want to see some of the really neat items that were pulled from that site. We're looking at 20 years later. Does ASI ever, or any archaeological company, do they ever go back and amend reports because of changing historical knowledge or changing historical perspectives?
God, I love that question. That's a great question. The answer to it is not in the report. Most companies do not do that. But what ASI does that most companies don't is publish. You will see the papers that were published here. And typically we wait a bit to publish either a book or articles about what we've done. But it's actually part of our core process is dissemination of knowledge. So what we're about is production of knowledge, right? That's what archaeology is about. And if you're not going to disseminate that, why bother? So the public school programs, the public program, and also publication is part of the effort to take what we do and get it out there in the public. That's the opportunity that we have in the publication period to correct mistakes that we might have made in the report or to address issues that came up during the excavation. And you know, these things happen from time to time, but it is definitely a moment to address them in the publications.
Wonderful. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions. Judy did post in the chat that the entrance to St. Andrew's Glen is Balmoral Road, which runs off of Niagara Stone Road, which is Highway 55. And that's directly across the street from the community center. So you can access the homestead there. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So thank you so much, Ron, for joining us today and sharing all of those findings. Our next lecture is Wednesday, February 22nd at 11 o'clock in the morning. And author and journalist Brian Martin will be joining us for his talk, Canada and the Civil War, Opening Eyes in Niagara and Beyond. And don't forget to register, and the link can be found on under the events calendar on our website, notlmuseum.ca. As always, if you wish to support our free virtual lecture series, other programming, and our collections, I will be posting a link in that chat box where you can make a donation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning and learning all about the Butler Homestead and the finds. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. We hope you don't blow away, but hopefully you get a chance to go out and enjoy this 15-degree weather in February. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.